Welcome, everyone. It is on the one hand good to see all of you and to have you all here joining us for this class. On the other hand, I'm sorry that this is the topic that brings everybody together. To be able to, it is a reality of our world and a reality of today's world in a very different way than it was even 3, 4 months ago. So people are still coming in. We're going to let you all make your way in. Um, while if you are eating and you don't, or you're in a place where you don't want to turn on your camera, I'm not going to force you to turn on your camera, but I really do encourage people to turn on cameras so that we can create a little bit of a sense of community. As much as I'd like to teach with everybody in one room together and be able to see each other and talk to each other, um, it's nice to be able to have that so that when we're talking with one another, people can see faces as well. Uh,
Even if we're moving around, Rabbi?
no, if you're moving around, then you can leave it off. But if you're able to, or when you're able to, turn on your camera so people can see everybody's faces. I would say smiling faces, but this is not a topic that creates smiling faces, so it's not going to be smiling faces today. Um, all right, let's begin. This class is similar to a class that I taught about 4 or 5 years ago on the same topic. But the reason I'm saying it's similar or not the same is the world has changed. And while the first couple of sessions are going to be foundational and are going to be very much the same when we talk about pagan and early Christian and Middle Ages and stuff like that, what anti-Semitism looks like, our responses to it, what's going on in the world in the last 3, 4 months has really changed the game. And so we will be dealing with that in the last class, if not the last two classes, talking about Israel and anti-Semitism and talking about how do we respond. So let's kind of take a look at the syllabus and the classes of what it's going to look like. This will be 5 sessions. Today, we'll do some introductions to the topic. We're going to talk about pagan and early Christian anti-Semitism, where some of these concepts started a long, long time ago. And we will look at that. Oops, didn't capitalize it. But anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages and race is a basis for anti-Semitism. Oh, I know. I went through and did a replace for anti-Semitism, and it decapitalized everything. Sorry, I'll try to fix it for next week. So looking at the Middle Ages, religious anti-Semitism, looking at the race moving into the Holocaust, we're going to sort of do that in one session. It could be a class. Each of those could be a class of 5 sessions, all on their own. So this will not be an in-depth, but it'll give us some of the fundamental ideas, and frankly, some of them that are still being used today. If you'll notice, we are skipping June 16th. So we go from the 9th to the 23rd. I will not be in town next week. So this class will not be, I won't get back in town before the class to teach it. So the 23rd is the next. On the 30th, we're going to talk about anti-Semitism today, some of the more modern forms of anti-Semitism, and kind of trying to parse our way through the old ideas that have found their way into today and some of the new ideas in terms of the way that we think about it. I'm just going to mute everybody really quickly just so that we don't get background noise. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and then unmute yourself. But I think I can see everybody on this today. Sometimes when we get to 2 pages, I can't. I always recommend people raise their hand by doing the electronic raise, not just by doing this, because sometimes I may not see it. But if you do the electronic raise through your menu bar, then you'll pop up to the top and I'll be able to see it a lot easier. So once again, anti-Semitism, looking at the old tropes that are still being used today, I mean, literally today, and some of the new kind of forms that anti-Semitism has taken on. We're going to spend one whole session on Israel and, the topic of, is being critical of Israel anti-Semitic, right? And that is the big topic of conversation nowadays. The anti-Israel people are saying, I'm not being anti-Semitic, I'm being anti-Israel. And where does that line, and how do we determine that line? Because we in democracies believe that we can be critical of our governments. Being critical of Israel is a national pastime in Israel, right? They do it all the time. But at what point in time does that become anti-Semitism? That's going to be our major conversation for that day. And then how do we respond? What do we do? And this will really bring it to today and what's going on and what's happening in San Diego. I'm going to be going to Mayor Gloria's State of the City address tomorrow. And he is expecting protesters because he has gotten protesters, anti-Israel protesters that follow him around everywhere. Congressman, oh my goodness, I just blanked on his name. Scott Peters. Congressman Scott Peters had people following him as well. So this is happening now. This is happening today. This is happening with, we were discussing it before people came on, with bomb threats that are being emailed to synagogues all over the country. This is not something of the past. This is not something of the 20th century. This is today. And we're going to really spend some time trying to decide what it is that we as the Jewish community should and can do in the face of anti-Semitism. Any questions on the syllabus? Once again, if you're registered for the class and you miss a class, you're welcome to let me or Bonnie know, and we'll get you the link to be able to watch it. Talise, what's your question? You have to unmute though. Oop, where'd you go? You lowered your hand, but you didn't unmute. There you go. Now you're unmuted.
Sorry. Are you going to touch at all on anti-Semitism in Islam?
Well, I think that's going to be part of it. That is definitely going to be part of it. It'll be part of our conversation from the earlier side in the Middle Ages. And it'll be part of our conversation in dealing with some of the anti-Israel pieces of all of this.
Good.
It's not going to be specific, though. We won't spend a lot of time on it.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions? All right. Well, let's jump in. Oh, go ahead, Peter.
Yeah, could you put the chat on, or you want that intentionally off? That we could leave you a comment.
Oh, I thought it looks like it's on.
Mine says only in group chat that you only can see it during the meeting.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before.
That's okay. Yeah, but you can put it, you can put stuff in there and I'll be able to see it. I prefer with this many people, I'm not going to be able to follow chat as much. So if you have a question, I'd prefer you raise your hand.
Are you going to address Zionism versus anti-Semitism as well?
Yes. No, we're actually going to have a big conversation about being critical of Israel. We're going to actually talk about Zionism. One of the things that I found is Jews don't understand Zionism. So part of what I'm going to do actually is almost half of that class is going to be a little bit about what is Zionism, because we're being told what Zionism is by the opponents of Zionism, and suffice it to say they're getting it wrong. And so if we don't know what Zionism actually is, we have no way of responding to it. So yes, we will absolutely be talking about Zionism. All right, let's go. We start, right? Why do people hate? And I just sort of started with this question as I was thinking about this class, and I came up, there was a website, you'll see where it comes from at the end with the source, that actually came up with three, what I thought were good and thoughtful reasons why people hate. Reason number one is that we seek a specific and identifiable outlook for our feelings of anger and fear, right? We human beings live in tension, right? The world is tough. Things don't always happen the way that we want them to. Our life isn't turning out the way that we want to. That creates anger, it creates fear. And that fear and anger builds. And almost like a lightning rod, right? We need a place to let that go. And if we do it in a healthy way, we go talk to a therapist and they help us, right? And we're able to let that go in a healthy way. But hate is an unhealthy way that actually accomplishes that same thing. It removes that anger and that fear that's building up in me and allows me to direct it out and get rid of it, at least for a time being. Unfortunately, what we find is very often it just keeps building back up and building back up again, right? But it gives us the possibility of being able to get rid of that. And a scapegoat is that lightning rod, right? We sort of put all of our anger, all of our frustrations on that one person, that one group. If only that person wouldn't have said this to me, I wouldn't be in this, or said this to my boss, I wouldn't be in this position, right? If only the Jews would, take care of the Palestinians and treat them nicely, none of this would be happening. There would be no problems in the Middle East. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's any sense of reality to it, obviously, but it allows us to get rid of that anger and that frustration. And that's one of the reasons that hate becomes a powerful tool, because it releases that for us. Number two is hate helps us deal with difference, right? When we encounter things that are different from us, that are foreign, that make us uncomfortable because of that difference, we have options on how to deal with it, right? A healthy option is to say, well, I don't know anything about this. Let me learn. Let me grow. Okay, that's a healthy way of dealing with difference. By the way, I would say, if not a healthy, a neutral way of dealing with it is saying, yeah, I don't have the time, I don't have the energy, it doesn't interest me, I'm going to live my life and I'm going to do my thing. And ignoring it, right? That's not necessarily a healthy way, but it's not necessarily a detrimental way unless we ignore problems, which is a different issue. But hate is a way of dealing with difference. I know what to do with that difference. I'm going to hate it. Now I know what to do with it. I'm going to get rid of it. I'm going to ostracize it. And the third reason is because hatred is actually energizing. If you've ever watched a mob or a group of people get themselves riled up, it is both frightening and intoxicating at the same time to watch that energy build, right? And hatred is energizing. It gives you purpose. It takes you away from the realities that you're feeling and makes you feel good, because it makes you feel like I can do something. These are three very interesting reasons that Jennifer Petulli, kind of put forward in her research of why people hate. But one of the things that we all agree on, one of the things that people who study this all agree on, is that hate is not something that is inherent in who we are. It is actually a learned behavior. It is not a natural state to hate. It may be a natural state to be fearful of difference, right? That's a protection mechanism. When we were, caveman, all of a sudden we go outside and we look at this big dinosaur, it's different from us. Well, a little bit of fear may be a good idea, right? It protects us. So fear is something that is a natural response, but hate is learned. When we talk about anti-Semitism specifically, there have been many forms throughout the many, many centuries of Jewish existence. And we're going to start with some of the earliest today as we get to it. But if you look around and you look at these different pictures, we see from the Middle Ages, we see from Pharaoh in Egypt, we see into the modern world, right? In the bottom lower left-hand side, the swastika, the Holocaust, right? It's found its ways forward against the Jews in pretty much every time period of our existence. And it is shaped and morphed over those years in interesting ways. And that's part of what we're going to be looking at in the history of how has anti-Semitism evolved when it no longer was in fashion to have anti-Semitism be a certain way, whether it be religious or racial. How did it then evolve again so that it could come out in a different way? So how do we define anti-Semitism? Well, the dictionary defines it as hostility or discrimination against Jews as religious, ethnic, or racial group. Is a simple definition. It's a good place to start. But the definition that is sort of the standard definition adopted by European Parliament in a lot of different places, although it is now a point of discussion in some educational forums and stuff like that about whether or not to accept this definition, is as follows. A certain perception of Jews, which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, toward Jewish community, institutions, and religious facilities. What's interesting about this is that it's all about perception. The person doesn't even have to be Jewish, but there can still be anti-Semitic statements and actions made against a non-Jew because I perceive them as being Jewish. The reality is irrelevant. Nan wrote, what is the discussion about European parliamentary description of anti-Semitism? So there's a number of different definitions of anti-Semitism. And we're going to actually get in the more modern times when we talk about it into a couple of other ones that I actually like better than this. But the question about whether anti-Israel should or shouldn't be part of that discussion is a big deal. And in educational systems that want to try and keep anti-Israel rhetoric alive, they don't accept those definitions of anti-Semitism that speak of anti-Israel, anti-Zionism being anti-Semitic. Another interesting definition that I just want to bring, it's not one that is sort of used, but as I was doing my research, I found this, and I liked what she had to say. Her name is Helen Fines, so professor and sociologist. She's written a bunch of different of books. This is how she defined it: a persisting latent structure of hostile beliefs towards Jews as a collectivity, manifested in individuals as attitudes, and in culture as myth, ideology, folklore, and imagery, and in actions, social or legal discrimination, political mobilizations against Jews and collective or state violence, which results in and or is designated to distance, displace, or destroy Jews as Jews. It's actually a very complicated, wordy thing. So let's just unpack it, right? The first piece is, I love this wording, a persisting latent structure. It has been going on forever. Latent, it's behind the scenes, it's just underneath everything, waiting to sort of come out. No other definition expresses that reality of anti-Semitism in quite the same way. And it's against Jews as a collectivity, right? As Jews, but it manifests itself either as individuals, or in individuals, as a culture, or as actions. And its purpose is to distance, displace, or destroy Jews as Jews. It's actually a very powerful definition. So, when did all of this start, right? What's the earliest accounts of anti-Semitism? Well, we're reading about it right now in the Torah. We just started the book of Exodus. There arose a Pharaoh in Egypt who knew not Joseph. Slavery, we got it, right? This is sort of the earliest recorded view of anti-Semitism against us as a people. That's not to say that there weren't other stories in the Bible of people acting against Abraham or against against Lot in Sodom and Gomorrah, right? But as a people, against the collective of the Jewish people, really persecution in Egypt is sort of the first biblical reference that we see to anti-Semitism. And if we believe the story, right, if we take the story at face value, what is the reason Pharaoh gives for wanting to enslave and destroy the Jews, right? Destroy the firstborn? Fear. He was afraid that the Jews would become too numerous and take over. The next sort of layer of stories that we have dealing with anti-Semitism are the stories of Purim and Chanukah, right? Purim, the book of Esther, being of a single anti-Semite, Haman, wanting to destroy the Jews as Jews. Now, you could argue, was it because Mordecai didn't bow down to him? That's not the way that the book reads, right? Yes, that was the precipitating factor that allowed him to act. But the book reads that he had it in for Jews all the way through. And that was Mordecai not bowing was just the opportunity that he could take to act on his ideology. In terms of Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah, we have the Hellenist Greeks who come in, the Greek Assyrians who come in, and Antiochus. His issue of anti-Semitism, I think, was much more political than religious, right? He wanted everybody to see him as God and to worship him. And the Jews said, no, we worship God. We don't worship people. And that was a problem for him. And so he came in and he destroyed the temple. And it wasn't until the Maccabees and the Hasmoneans came up and had a rebellion and fought against Antiochus that the temple was able to be rededicated and go back to its work. So again, two stories that have their origins in anti-Semitism against the Jews. Going back actually a little earlier, I wanted to get the two most well-known out of the way first, so I'm not doing this in order of chronology. I'm doing this in order of what people know. The next one actually is the story of Bil'am in the Bible, right? In the book of Numbers, Bil'am was hired by Balak to go and curse the Jews. And he then says famously, how can I curse what God has not cursed? How can I do what God has not? I see them from the mountaintops. I gaze on them from the heights. Look, a people that dwells alone, not reckoned among the nations. He ultimately praises and blesses the Israelites instead of cursing them. But the origin of this story, right, is the hatred of the Jews by Balak. Again, that was probably political, not religious, because he didn't want these people in his property, in his kingdom, in his area. The reality is that the Jewish issue, right, as Jews, really is not really a concern for pagans. Why? Because pagans, for the most part, you could have many gods. So the Jews can worship their God. I'm going to worship my God. Everybody's happy. The pagans were sort of used to that, right? Yes, Jews were different. Jews were different, and it set them apart in Greek or Roman times, right? Especially when it came to things like, okay, First Commandment doesn't allow Jews to participate in a larger pagan community. Sometimes there's, well, everyone's going to go and worship their own idols in this great pantheon. No, we can't do that. So that sets us apart. Or maybe the fourth commandment with Shabbat. We can't work on Shabbat. Okay. That creates a difference. And for the most part, because the Jews were good taxpayers, the Romans actually let them do their thing. And it may have created some jealousy among the population. But the reality is, you didn't see widespread anti-Semitism, anti-Jewish belief or ideology in the Roman population until the rebellion. And then it wasn't anti-Judaism or anti-Semitism as a religion. It was, there's a people rebelling against Rome, and therefore we're going to destroy the temple. There's a people rebelling against Rome in 163, therefore, Bar Kokhba revolt, we're going to put it down. It was business. It wasn't anti-Semitism in that sort of way. There were a couple of times, right? Flakus tried to get the Jews to not celebrate Shabbat. We see this in Josephus, actually. If a sudden enemy invasion, an overflow of the Nile, a conflagration, a thunderbolt, a famine, a plague, an earthquake, or other disaster occurred on Saturday, would you still stay there and remain calmly in your homes? Right? It's again this jealousy, or this, you Jews aren't working. Would you remain in your synagogues in solemn session reading your sacred books? Right? No. Without wasting a moment, you would seek to shelter your parents, your children, your fortune, all that is dear to you. So why don't you then, if you're going to do it for that, why don't you do it for us? Okay. But it wasn't that big of a deal. In reality, the issues began with Christianity. That's when anti-Semitism and the anti-Jewish beliefs started to emerge. And they really came to fruition with Constantine in 321. So hundreds of years after Jesus and the death of Jesus, right? And the original Christians, because many of the original Christians were Jews. But when Constantine became Christian, and there is some debate as to what actually happened with Constantine and all of that. I'm not going to get into the scholarly debate on exactly what happened at that time, but church ideology could be put into broader practice because Christianity now had a broader audience. We know that the origins of Christianity are in Judaism, and Christianity, in essence, broke off from Judaism because of Paul and Paul's teachings. Prior to Paul, there was some ability for Jews and Christians to really kind of intermix and intermingle. But Paul came in and said, the law is no longer what is going to save us. We need to turn away from the law and turn to Jesus as our Savior. And belief in Jesus as a Savior became primary. And that was the main division between Judaism and Christianity. For those in my basic Judaism class, we'll be talking about that in a few weeks. The later Gospels became more and more hostile to Jews, especially Matthew and John. And we started to see some themes come into these Gospels, two of them, in fact. The first are that Jews are affiliated with evil. Jews are affiliated with Satan, right? You are of your father, the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires, speaking about Jews specifically. And then in Matthew, we see the idea that the Jews were involved in the crucifixion of Jesus. Then answered all the people, Israel, right? And said, his blood be on us and on our children. This idea that Jews were involved in the killing, crucifixion of Jesus created even more, as you can imagine, animosity. Aside from the fact, by the way, that in order for Jesus to save humanity, he had to die on the cross. That's a different issue. There's still anger at the Jews, at least according to Matthew, for being a part of it, which historically was actually not true and impossible, frankly. The fact that Jews and Judaism persisted was literally, well, not literally, I guess figuratively, a thorn in the side of Christians. Because Christians saw themselves as Veris Israel, as the true Israel. And therefore, that they have now come to replace that original covenant, that original relationship of the Old Testament with the new. And if the Jews are still there, still keeping their traditional ways of doing things, saying, hey, this still is working, that's a tough sell then for the Christians to say, well, no, we're really the true Israel. Well, aren't they Israel? St. Augustine also created some real divisions and helped sort of fuel the fire of anti-Semitism. He took this idea of Veris Israel and he really talked, at least according to St. Jerome, that, St. Jerome shared that St. Augustine established anew the ancient faith, right? That he was the one that redid everything, this new Israel. And St. Augustine really talked about the fact, and this is where some of the Christian anti-Semitism really comes into play, which we're going to talk about a lot next week, or actually in 2 weeks. The fact that the Jews are still alive and here is in order to be humiliated, to show the triumph of the church over the synagogue. Let me say that again, right? How do you change? How do you deal with this idea of Veris Israel, the true Israel? We're now the new Israelites, but those Israelites are still there. So you have to say something about them. So what they said was, they're still there because of their A, killing of Christ, and B, denial of the true faith. They are there to be humiliated and punished. And their persecution proves the right of Christianity. Well, that opens up anti-Semitism as not only something that is just about difference, about fear, but now it becomes a religious and moral imperative to humiliate the Jews, right? To make sure that the Jews are seen as being downtrodden. Again, this is very early. This is, 354 to 430 CE. But these are the origins, the early origins of what we see later on, especially into the Middle Ages. And that's what we're going to look at more in the next lesson. That leads into blood libels and inquisitions and all of those sorts of things. These are the foundations of what we call religious anti-Semitism, right? The first form of anti-Semitism, the original form of anti-Semitism, was religious anti-Semitism. And it stemmed truly from Christianity. The reality is, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the Middle Ages, going to what Sophia Cully was talking about earlier, for the most part, Islam had no problem with Jews. And in the Middle Ages, we see that it was during the Islamic period, when Islam was in charge of Europe, that was the golden age of Spain, right? And North Africa and that area, when Islam was there. And Jews were part of that, creating poetry, creating all sorts of different things. It wasn't until the Christians came back that we started to see this type of ideology come back into play. And we started to see the blood libels and the inquisitions and those sorts of things, and the persecution and the Crusades, right? And the persecution of Jews in the way that we ultimately see it in Christianity. The reality is, and we don't really talk about it, the number of Jews that died percentage-wise due to anti-Semitism in the Middle Ages for the Crusades far outnumbered the number of Jews that died during the Holocaust. Percentage of Jewish population, right? Now, the Holocaust is more recent. We think about it that way. But there were hundreds and thousands of Jews that were killed, that were burned, it was a lot. And the population was rather small. So what are our conclusions for today? First, hate is an ancient and learned trait. It was taught, it was promoted, it was fostered, it was nurtured. Anti-Semitism dates all the way back to biblical times. And it has morphed and changed and evolved in all sorts of interesting ways to keep it alive. Shannon. Sorry, you have to unmute yourself. Otherwise, we can't hear you. Yep. Other one, the microphone. I know it's hard on a phone. Bring the young one in to help. Are we getting there? I can't hear. Let me see. I can ask to unmute, and then maybe you can push the button.
Thank you.
There you
Thank you.
go.
Thank you. Hi.
Sure.
So,
Let me take one thing.
okay. To your knowledge, what is the oldest non-biblical source documenting anti-Semitism?
Oldest non-biblical source.
Yes.
I don't know. It's a good question.
Okay. Just curious. You
I
don't
mean,
have to know.
it's probably going to be, well, it depends on how you define biblical. So from a Jewish perspective, the New Testament isn't biblical. So I would constitute that as being the oldest non-biblical source. But if you're going to count the New Testament as biblical,
Mhm. Yes.
then it's going to really be some of these early Christian documents that are not in the New Testament that come out about Jews.
Right. I was thinking could be anything from archaeological evidence to religious writings.
Yeah, there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence. Right? It's not like we found, kill the Jews on the pyramids in Egypt. Like,
Right.
it's not. That's not. We don't really see that there. But we do start to see the writings of early Christians, things like that bring very anti-Jewish ideology.
Okay.
I would say
So-
that's probably the earliest.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Okay. Peter, go ahead.
My understanding was, though, you had two competing Christian churches at one time, after Jesus's death, between Paul and his brother James, and all these Gnostic things were going on at the same time, and it didn't get really anti-Semitic really until Constantine.
Agreed.
Where he needed an excuse because the Roman Empire was falling apart, and
So
they
look,
needed
Paul-
to replace it.
Yeah, here's what I would say. It didn't get, I would agree with what you said, Peter, is that it didn't get truly anti-Semitic until Constantine. That being said, Paul had an inherent interest in differentiating Christianity from Judaism. I can't imagine that it was always done in the nicest way.
Sure, he didn't.
Right?
He didn't want the covenant, the blood.
Correct. So whether it was anti-Semitism the way that we understand it, or it was the foundation of saying other and different, that started already with Paul. But I would agree with you. It isn't until Constantine that we see anti-Semitism becoming corporate, so to speak, right? Becoming part of the Christian ethos.
And my other understanding is that really Catholicism and Protestantism also did the same thing. In England, the York Massacre in 1066 and the Spanish Inquisition, was just really to keep, the wealth. It was a wealth thing to a large extent.
Yeah, I mean, to some degree, it was to keep their power and to keep wealth and power are equated, certainly at that time. Beth, and then Cherie.
I just wondered what you feel like is the biggest contributing factor to the growth of the anti-Semitism, like in we're in 2024, like throughout all these years since that time. Do you think there's one major contributing factor, or it's just so many different ones?
No, I mean, it goes back to those original three things that we started with, right? That's the reason that anti-Semitism and hate continues, right? The fact that it's directed at us, we've just been the common target, and we haven't been the only target, right? There have been other minorities that have experienced and are continuing to experience prejudice. I don't want to take anything away, right? The minorities are, the Kurds are being treated horribly right now in Turkey, right? So hatred is hatred, but there is a unique hatred for Jews that has become the longest standing hatred in existence, and that is called anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Because Jews, and this kind of goes, I mean, remember what we said, Beth, you were in the class we just had, right? We
Mhm.
were talking about Kedusha, we were talking about holiness, and to some degree, holiness means distinction and being different. Well, that leads into all of these sorts of things that we're talking about.
Yeah. It's such a hard thing to like wrap your head around, that there's that much hatred.
I agree. But the reality is that there is, and we see it.
Yeah.
We see it. Cherie.
So my question was about what led to the Jews as being associated with the devil.
It's a good question. I don't know why John went in that direction. He doesn't say, per se, other than the devil is about tempting people away from the true faith. So if you are a group of people who say, actually, we're the true faith, you're the new version of this, right? And you don't need to believe in Jesus for salvation, all of these sorts of things, then we're tempting people away from that faith. And maybe that's an association, right? We're sort of doing the same thing supposedly that the devil is doing. At least those were the claims that were made in Middle Ages Europe with the Inquisition.
Can I say something?
Hang on one second, Shannon, and then Liz.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, great. Are we going to be addressing DEI at some point
We
and
can.
its
I
impact?
think we can. There have definitely been. Here's what I will say, and we can talk about this in the response when we get to the response.
Sure.
There are groups, okay, that have been taken over by anti-Semitic hate. DEI can be argued to be one of them. Black Lives Matter can be argued to be one of them, right? There are certain groups where the anti-Semitism of today, at least especially from the left, because we're going to talk about modern anti-Semitism both from the right and the left, in terms of the modern world. Lucky us, we Jews, the only thing we've gotten the far right and the far left to agree on is that they hate us.
Right.
Right? So when we're talking about the anti-Semitism that's found in some of the Black Lives Matter rhetoric, when we see it in DEI rhetoric, when we're seeing it now on university campuses,
Mhm.
right?
Exactly.
Right? Those things are coming from that side of it. DEI as a concept isn't
Mhm.
anti-Semitic. It's been co-opted.
Mhm.
Black Lives Matter as a concept isn't anti-Semitic. It's been co-opted.
Mhm.
So So that's why I want to be very careful about what I say. I don't say DEI is anti-Semitic,
Mhm.
but the DEI movement has been co-opted by the far left, which is rabidly anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Right? So we just have to be careful about how we use those words, because I'm in favor of diversity and I'm in favor of equity and I'm in favor of inclusion,
Sure.
right? You know, I don't have a problem with DEI, but when you start putting titles on things, it becomes an issue. It becomes an issue.
It's the sort of oppressor oppressed
Right.
kind of.
Well, that is sort of the new piece to all of this,
Mhm.
right? That we're starting to see when we talk about the modern. So we went from, you know, it's actually, Zionism is still there, but there's an added piece to the Zionism component, which is this colonialist piece, which is actually fairly new.
Mm.
And that's what we're going to talk about when we get to
Response.
Yeah, when we get to that response,
Okay.
for sure, 100%.
Okay.
Liz.
I just wanted to say that when Constantine made Christianity the religion, he changed so much of what the religion was by making the Pope God on earth and the people having to confess their sins to him and get forgiveness through their deeds. It was a government.
Look,
And throughout
no doubt.
history of the church, even in Protestantism, with Scotland and England going back and forth between Catholicism and Protestantism, all the kings that wanted control, they were appointed by God, supposedly. Even today,
Yeah, so Liz,
it's a
there's no
government
doubt.
control of the people.
There's no doubt.
Yeah.
Hatred, one of the pieces that isn't up there, right? Hatred, when used in the political realm, is about control.
Yeah, yeah,
And we see that in Nazi Germany, right?
definitely.
We see that in the Inquisition. And we saw that in some of the early times of what you're talking about as well. Yes, there's a lot of controversy about early Christian history. In the same way, by the way, there's controversy in the academics about early Jewish history, right? About how
Right.
it happened and what happened and all those sorts of things. So I agree. But the end result of no matter which scholar you agree with about how that all happened, the reality is anti-Semitism took deep root. And not only in Catholicism, but in Protestantism as well. It wasn't like, later on that, oh, well, the Catholic Church was deeply anti-Semitic, but the Protestant Church isn't. No, that's actually not the case. Right?
That's correct. The
they brought
father
that
of
over.
Protestantism got really angry at the Jews, and that was part of, I forgot his name.
Luther, yeah.
Yeah, Luther, and
Mhm.
it became a part of Nazism.
That is
Anyway,
true. All right,
yeah.
let me finish up the conclusions, because I want to be sensitive to people on time, and I want to make sure that everybody can get out on time. We just have a few more conclusions from today. The Bible, it appeared, anti-Semitism appeared when differences were highlighted between Jewish and other cultures. We sort of saw that there, whether it be Egypt, whether it be Bilam, those sorts of things. Early pagan anti-Semitism kind of brought all of this over, continued it, although it wasn't as venomous. They just kind of carried along with the way everybody thought. Once Christianity came on the scene, anti-Semitism then began to change, and it was a powerful way of differentiating between Christianity and Judaism. You don't want to be part of them. They're evil, right? And early Christian beliefs saw Jews as evil and responsible then for the death of Jesus, which Augustine then promoted. Finally, what we ended with was this idea that the Jews' suffering was a punishment for that denial of Jesus. And therefore, not only is it okay that Jews suffer, but maybe me as a good Christian, I'm supposed to make that happen and be proactive about that. All right, Peter, last quick question.
But where in your talk does Islam figure in this, or it doesn't yet, because that's 200
Doesn't yet.
years
Islam
later.
isn't even on the scene.
So you think this all happens before Islam even exists?
Yeah. Again, I would argue that the problem between Judaism and Islam did not originate as an anti-Semitic issue. It has become an anti-Semitic issue. But the problem between Islam and Judaism is all about land. And it's all about Israel.
It's all about the money.
It's all about Israel, right? And then they picked up on some of the, now some of the biggest promoters of blood libels, which again we'll talk about next time. Some of the biggest promoters of blood libels are the Arab countries. But they picked up on that from the Christians. That wasn't their shtick, right? That didn't happen until really the modern time. And during most of the Middle Ages, Judaism and Islam had no issues. Now, we weren't treated as equal to Muslims. We were dhimmi, we were second-class citizens, and we had to pay the dhimmi tax, but we were seen as people of the book, and we were treated well and allowed to do our things, right? Rambam was the court physician for the Muslim court. No problem. That never would happen in Christianity under Christian ruler. So the hatred that we see, or the problem that we see between Islam and Judaism, is actually a modern, I would argue, is a modern phenomenon, not something that stems from earlier. That's not to say, by the way, that there weren't moments, and we'll see, we'll talk about it. There weren't moments when Muslim rulers, tried to crush the Jews, but that it wasn't a part of the culture the way that it is a part of the culture in Christianity. Because the culture of Islam is about accepting Jews and Christians as dhimmi, as people of the book. Tom wrote, and I would agree to some, I think we have to dig into it, right? All these examples suggest that hatred is rooted in groups applying their own rules and philosophies to groups with different rules and philosophies. Yeah, but I don't think it's only that, Tom. I think it's a little bit more complex than that, but I think that's true. I think your statement is a true statement. Nan asks to define dhimmi. Dhimmi is the second status. So in Muslim society, there is the ummah, there is the people who are Muslim, there is the dhimmi, which are the second-class citizens, and those are Jews and Christians because they are people of the book. And then there is everyone else, the pagans, who you're supposed to convert or kill, right? So Jews and Christians were allowed to maintain their Jewish or Christian beliefs in Middle Ages under Islam for the most part. But if you were pagan, you either had to convert to Islam or you would be killed. But Jews were not. Jews did not have to convert. That's dhimmi. And you had to pay a dhimmi tax. Spelled, by the way, D-H-I-M-I, just in case you're interested. You want to look it up in Wikipedia or whatever. But you had to pay a dhimmi tax. And there were rules of things that you could and couldn't do and stuff like that. But otherwise, you were fine. You certainly weren't killed, and you didn't have to convert to Islam. Okay. Any other questions before we end for this week? A reminder We will not have class on the 16th. We will have class again on the 23rd, I believe is the next Tuesday. And it'll be a very packed class, so try to get here on time because I'm going to want to start as quickly in the beginning because we're going to try to get through both the morphing of religious anti-Semitism into the Middle Ages and the morphing of racial anti-Semitism into the Holocaust. And we're going to try to do both in one session. And I know it's a lot. We may go a few minutes later if we have to. Okay.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Have a great week, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
that was
Thank
very interesting. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Be safe tomorrow.
Thank you. You too.
Sure.